Hi guys, so I'm back today with another video for you, and today we're going to cover scientifically backed guidelines for hypertrophy. Now, in the past there wasn't that much study done on specifically hypertrophy. Most of the sports science stuff was on improving performance with athletes. We kind of had to extrapolate from that what might work well for bodybuilders or guys or girls just wanting to pack on some muscle. More recently, there's been a lot more research. People like Brad Schoenfeld have been sort of pushing the boundaries of our knowledge with more and more research, and there's loads of stuff coming out now, which is great and makes our life a little bit easier, makes my life a bit easier for having some guidelines to put in place that are not only based on experience and seeing what works for myself and with clients, but based on what the science shows. So today I'm going to discuss intensity, volume, frequency, training to failure, rest periods, range of motion, and your rep speed or the tempo of the lift, and how they apply to your training and what sort of the science at the moment tells us about these. So first up is intensity. So just quickly to define that, intensity means the percentage of one rep max that you're lifting with. So if you can lift 100 kilos, 70% of that is 70 kilos, so you're training with a load of 70% of intensity. Likewise, if you had a weight that was 55%, that would be training an intensity of 55%. So what the research seems to indicate is that basically, for the most part, you want to be lifting loads heavier than 65% of your one rep max. So loads that maybe have you being able to do 12 to 15 reps or heavier than that. Now, this seems to provide enough mechanical tension to stimulate adaptations, so there's enough loading, it's heavy enough to force your body to adapt, and it allows you to get quite a high amount of training volume, which we'll learn soon is an important element. Now, just quickly, that's not to say you can't use lighter loads than this. They have a use and have been shown actually to cause hypertrophy. The point is that that's a very specific kind of metabolite time training when you're just focusing on metabolic stress and getting a really good pump, a lot of blood flow to the muscle. Now, they can have a nice additive effect to working your heavier stuff, and I think if periodised and planned in at various times, that can add a nice benefit. However, just always training light won't get you the results you desire, won't get you optimal results. So most of your work should be done at 65% one rep max or heavier. So stuff that you're failing at 12 reps is probably a good frame of reference. Mostly be doing stuff that's a challenging set of 12 or fewer reps than that. So then that brings us on to volume. Now, volume, assuming you're lifting at above that 65% threshold, volume is then the next. Volume is then the key influence of your ability to build muscle. It seems that there's a dose-response relationship, meaning the more volume you can handle and train, the better your hypertrophy, up to a point, and that's when you fail to recover and actually results plateau or drop off. So the more hard sets, the more hard training you can do above 65% 1RM, then the better your hypertrophy will be, just as long as you take into account there will become a ceiling when you can't just keep smashing more and more sets, and then you'll have to back off, deload, and then go again. So numerous studies have showed that multiple sets are better than just one set as well. Sometimes people think you can get away with just doing one set. That'll work if you're a beginner, but as you train more and more and your training career progresses, you'll need more volume to stimulate hypertrophy. And just to reiterate, assuming you're above 65% 1RM, the current science shows that volume is the key driver of hypertrophy. So then frequency. Frequency is how often you train a muscle group per week. So the science at the moment seems to indicate that 2 to 3 times a week is a best recommendation for most muscles. Now, there's not that much study on this, to be fair, and so whilst 2 definitely appears better than 1, we can't say if 3 is better than 2 or 4 is better than 3, for example, because there just isn't enough data out there. But based on what we know, 2 to 3 times a week is a pretty good guideline. And I'd suggest for really big muscle groups, it's 2 times a week. For smaller muscle groups, 3 times a week. So, for example, your legs, you might be best served training those twice a week, but you can train arms, shoulders, chest, three times a week. And actually, with that in mind, I think it's important to think of the muscle specific and how often that can be trained. For example, if you just think your biceps, like when were they last really trashed and sore, you can probably train them 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 days a week and get good results. Whereas if you try to train your quads 6 times a week, you'd probably be absolutely ruined and just wouldn't recover. Likewise, your shoulders, your lateral delts, your rear delts, they'll handle quite a lot of training frequency. They recover well. Calves is another example. You can probably train quite frequently. So as a rule of thumb, 2 to 3 times a week, but don't be afraid to experiment with maybe some slightly higher frequencies on the smaller muscle groups. Okay, so that brings us on to training to failure. Should you go to failure? Some people say you've always got to go to failure, otherwise it's not worth it. Whereas other people say never go to failure. You'll fry yourself. You'll never recover. Well, it seems to suggest that it's not required that you go to failure, but done occasionally probably results in better hypertrophy. So, rule of thumb is maybe don't always be going to failure. Perhaps at the start of your program, week 1, you're leaving a couple of reps in reserve. Week 2, you push the envelope a bit more. Week 3 again. And by week 4, 5, 6, you're hitting failure on 1 set per exercise, couple of sets per exercise, that sort of thing. So actually, across the course of that program, you're getting closer and closer to failure, pushing your limits until eventually the volume goes up. Through adding sets, you do more and more sets close to failure. Then you struggle to recover. You reach your ability to recover, and then that's the time you have to deload, like we talked about earlier. Take a deload week, back off, and then build up again. Then rest periods, another thing to consider. Often people don't really consider. They just finish a set and then they're like, checking Instagram, Facebook, texting their mates, whatever, until they feel like doing next set. I think that's a mistake. You probably should pay a bit more attention to that. And I know with my clients in my own training, I time my rest periods. Now, that's not to say that you must go on 90 seconds exactly when the clock ticks over. It's not that specific, not that precise, but it's a good idea to have an idea. Firstly, for comparing your logbook, right? If you were doing squats and taking 60 seconds rest one session and then 3 minutes rest between sets the next, well, obviously you're going to do a lot more work in the second session, which is great, but you might think you're making amazing progress, but essentially all you did was give yourself longer rest. So keeping an eye on it from that point of view, I think is useful just for practically keeping an eye on how your program's coming together and are you genuinely progressing. But the data in the research seems to indicate that when it comes to rest periods, basically avoid taking too short rest periods which compromise your overall volume. So we talked about training volume earlier, which is sets times reps times load, and the overall workload you get in per exercise, per session, per week. Resting really short times to maybe increase and try and get a pump, if that compromises the overall volume by any significant amount, it's shooting yourself in the foot. You're cutting off your nose to spite your face, essentially. So how does that look in practical terms? Well, for compound movements, squats, deadlifts, bench, pull-ups, you're looking at probably you want to be taking 2 to 3 minutes rest if you're doing sets of 6 to 12. Yeah, 2 to 3 minutes is probably a good number to have there. Smaller muscle groups, you do some bicep curls, some natural raises, you can bring rest down probably to anywhere between 60 to 120 seconds, so 1 to 2 minutes. Probably that sweet spot might be around 90 seconds for a lot of those lifts, and that should allow you to get sufficient recovery to put a good effort in for the next set, keep volume high, and keep each set a good quality. Now, again, like we talked about intensity, there are applications for sometimes using lighter loads and getting a really good pump. Well, rest periods can be manipulated if that's your goal. If you're trying to drive metabolic stress, maybe you bring those rest periods right down, 30 seconds on like a machine-based exercise, like a leg extension or something, and just get a really nasty pump in your quads. Fine, that can have application, but you've got to know why you're doing it. Don't make that your default. Now, moving on to range of motion. So, basically, the research indicates that full range of motion should be used. Full range equals full development, partial range equals partial development. So work the muscle through the full spectrum of its range into the fully lengthened and the fully contracted position, and get strong across the whole range. Now, that will do you a great service when it comes to building muscle. There are special circumstances for that. For example, some exercises you're really weak in the lengthened position and the shortened position. but you're strong in the mid-range. Well, you want to challenge that muscle across the whole range. So perhaps you're doing sets where you stretch it and challenge it in that range, and then also in the shorter range, but you're also using a different exercise or using a partial range of motion in this exercise to really challenge that mid-range. So you might do that. Or, for example, on something like a bench press variation or a close grip bench, you might do pin presses off racks to challenge the lockout to really hit your triceps more, because that's what you're trying to target, and they're doing more of the work at lockout than they are earlier on in the movement. So there are some special circumstances where you may use a partial range, but they should make a very small percentage of an overall training program. Most of the time, do full range. Okay, finally, rep speed or the tempo of your lift. To be honest, it has little impact on hypertrophy. The research doesn't really show that it's that important. However, using slow eccentrics, so the lowering phase of weight, doing it nice and controlled, a 3, 4, maybe even a 5-second lowering phase, has shown to increase muscle damage. And muscle damage is one of 3 factors, along with mechanical tension and metabolic stress, which can drive hypertrophy and be one of the mechanisms behind hypertrophy. With that said, most of the time, rather than worrying about counting a 5-second eccentric, a pause, and then a 2-second lift or whatever, getting bogged down in those details and not just focusing on working hard, you're best served using a pretty controlled eccentric and concentric movement. So lower the weight in a couple of seconds and lift it pretty explosively. Do most of your work like that, you'll get great results. Again, a bit like that range of motion, there are times when you might specifically manipulate rep speed to try and get an added stimulus, working in a pause to take the stretch reflex out, for example, or really trying to emphasize the muscle damage and doing a nice slow lowering phase. But most of the time, pretty standard, nice controlled lifting phase on the way down, drive it up fast. All right, guys, so that gives you an overview of some of the key factors of hypertrophy and what science tells us about it. If you've got any other questions, feel free to drop me a comment or get in touch on social media, Instagram or Facebook. Drop me a question or a comment there too, and I'll be happy to try and help get back to you with some answers. Until next time, catch you later.